"It's too big, I can't." The virgin rancher panicked. His giant mail-order bride said, "You will, it's too big." "I can't," Caleb Thornwell whispered, his virgin hands trembling as he stared at the woman towering over him in their wedding night bedroom. The giant mail-order bride he'd married just hours ago, Marin Ashford, 6 feet 2 inches of pure frontier strength, stepped closer, her shadow swallowing the lamplight, and the terrified rancher pressed against the wall. "You will," she said, her voice firm but strangely gentle as she reached for him. And in that moment, Caleb panicked, his breath catching because this massive woman wasn't just bigger than any bride he'd imagined. She was everything he feared, and somehow everything he needed. But what this virgin rancher didn't know was that his giant mail-order bride carried a secret that made her just as terrified as him. And what she whispered next would either destroy him or save his dying ranch. Why would a woman this powerful answer a desperate rancher's advertisement? What was this giant bride running from? And when Caleb finally stopped panicking and discovered what "you will" truly meant, would it be too late to save them both? 3 days earlier, Caleb had been sitting in the Montana Territorial Bank with his hat crushed between his hands, watching his entire world collapse. Banker Harold Grissom leaned back in his leather chair, fingers drumming on the mahogany desk like a death march. "Mr. Thornwell," Grissom said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "your mother's medical debts and 3 years of failed cattle prices have left you exactly 30 days. Pay the $700 you owe, or the Thornwell Ranch becomes bank property." Caleb's throat went dry. $700 might as well have been 7,000. He'd spent 12 years running that ranch alone, ever since his father broke his neck trying to rope a maverick steer when Caleb was just 16. He'd become man of the house overnight, caring for his sick mother while learning to brand cattle, mend fences, and survive Montana winters that killed weaker men. But Grissom wasn't finished. He leaned forward, eyes glinting like a snake spotting a wounded rabbit. "A man alone can't run a spread that size, Thornwell. You need help. You need a wife. But what woman would choose a struggling rancher who barely talks to people?" The words hit Caleb like fists, because Grissom was right. Caleb had spent his 20s watching his mother die slowly from consumption, holding her hand through coughing fits that sprayed blood on the pillowcases, reading to her when she was too weak to hold a book. There had been no time for dances or courting or learning how to talk to women. And now, at 28, he was still a virgin who'd never even kissed a girl, watching his family's legacy slip through his fingers like water. That night, sitting alone in his small ranch house with the lamplight flickering across newspaper pages, Caleb found the advertisement. "Sturdy, capable woman seeks honest work and respectable marriage. Experienced in farming, livestock, and frontier hardship. No romantic illusions, seeking partnership and security." His hand shook as he dipped his pen in ink. What could he possibly offer a woman? He had no money, no charm, no experience. But he had land. He had honesty, and he had desperation sharp enough to cut through his fear. "Dear Miss Ashford," he wrote, "I'm a rancher of modest means, seeking a wife of practical disposition. I cannot promise luxury, but I can offer honest work, a roof overhead, and respectful treatment. If you seek partnership over poetry, I believe we might suit." He paused, staring at the paper. Then, because he couldn't help himself, he added one more line. "I should mention I'm not experienced in matters of courtship or matrimony. I hope this does not discourage you." What Caleb didn't write was the truth that kept him awake at night, that the thought of touching a woman terrified him more than breaking wild horses or facing down timber wolves, that he had no idea what happened in a marriage bed beyond whispered rumors that made his face burn, that he was so desperately lonely he sometimes talked to his horses just to hear a voice answer back. 2 weeks later, Caleb stood on the Bozeman train station platform, clutching wildflowers he'd picked that morning, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The train screeched to a stop, steam hissing like a living thing, and passengers began stepping down. Caleb scanned the crowd, looking for the woman Marin had described in her letter. Tall, strong build, auburn hair. Then the crowd parted, and Caleb's flowers dropped from his nerveless fingers. She wasn't just tall, she was magnificent. 6 feet, 2 inches of pioneer strength, with auburn braids coiled around her head like a crown and shoulders broader than most men in town. Her traveling dress was practical calico, but it couldn't hide the raw power in her frame, arms that could lift fence posts, hands that had wrestled livestock, a body built for survival on the brutal frontier. The entire platform went silent. Men stared with their mouths open. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes wide with shock and something that looked like fear. And Maren Ashford walked through that silence like a queen walking through hostile territory, her chin high but her eyes guarded, scanning for the man who'd answered her letter. When she spotted Caleb, barely 5'7", slender as a willow branch, looking up at her with pure terror on his face, something flickered across her features. Not surprise, resignation, like she'd been here before and knew exactly how this would end. "Caleb Thornwell?" she asked, her voice deeper than he expected, roughened by years of frontier living. Yes," Caleb stammered, his neck craning back just to meet her eyes. "You're Miss Ashford?" "I wrote that I was tall," Maren said, and there was something defensive in her tone now, walls going up brick by brick. "You did get that part of my letter." Caleb's brain had stopped working. All he could do was stare at this woman who made him feel like a child standing next to his mother. "You said tall," he managed. "I didn't imagine. I mean, you're..." Maren's jaw tightened. Her hands gripped her carpetbag until her knuckles went white. "If this is a problem, Mr. Thornwell, I have return fare. I've been turned away before by men who wanted a woman, not a..." "Beautiful," Caleb blurted out. The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Maren stopped, stared. Nobody had called her beautiful since she was 12 years old, and shot up past every boy in her Minnesota school. "I was going to say beautiful," Caleb continued, words tumbling out faster now because his mouth had disconnected from his brain. "And strong. You look like you could help with the spring roundup. And the fencing!" And he stopped, realizing how terrible that sounded. "I'm making this worse, aren't I?" For the first time since stepping off that train, Maren smiled. It transformed her entire face, softening the hard edges survival had carved into her features. "Are you always this honest?" she asked. "I don't know how to be anything else," Caleb admitted. And in that moment, something passed between them that neither understood. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd spent their entire lives being told they were wrong, too small, too big, too quiet, too much, suddenly seeing someone who might understand what that felt like. They walked through Bozeman toward the minister's house, and every eye in town followed them like they were a circus act. The tiny rancher and his giant bride. Caleb could hear the whispers, feel the stares burning into his back like hot coals. "Lord have mercy. She's bigger than my husband," one woman said, not even trying to keep her voice down. "Poor Thornwell," a man snickered from outside the saloon. "That wedding night's gonna kill him." Caleb's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His face burned with shame so intense it felt like standing too close to a forge. But Maren just kept walking, her head high, her shoulders back, like she was marching into battle instead of toward a wedding. Her hands, though, Caleb noticed her hands were gripping that carpetbag so tight her knuckles had gone bone white. "Still want to go through with this?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. And Caleb surprised himself. Maybe it was the shame, maybe it was the desperation, maybe it was something about the way she held herself, like she'd learned to be strong because nobody else would protect her. "Let them talk," he said louder than he meant to. "I need a partner who can work." "You need a home. That's more honest than most marriages start with." Maren's step faltered. Just for a second. Then she glanced down at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her eyes. "Then let's make this partnership official, Mr. Thornwell." The ceremony lasted maybe 10 minutes in Minister Hadley's cramped parlor that smelled like old books and furniture polish. No guests, no flowers, no music. Just Hadley reading from his worn Bible, stumbling over words because he kept staring at the height difference like he'd never seen anything so strange in his life. Do you, Caleb Thornwell, take this woman? I do, Caleb said, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. And do you, Maren Ashford, take this man? I do, Maren said, meeting Caleb's eyes, and for a moment the whole world narrowed down to just the two of them. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, you may kiss your bride. The awkward moment stretched out like taffy. Maren had to bend down. Caleb had to stretch up on his toes. Their lips met briefly, chaste, nervous, barely more than a brush of skin against skin. But when they pulled apart, both of them were blushing like teenagers, and Caleb's heart was doing something strange in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. Minister Hadley coughed. Well, congratulations. That'll be $2. Caleb paid with coins he'd been saving for winter supplies, and just like that, he had a wife. A giant mail-order bride who was now legally bound to him, for better or worse, until death parted them. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours in Caleb's old wagon, the horse plodding along the rutted mountain road while the sun sank lower and lower toward the peaks. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They were strangers who'd just promised their lives to each other based on a few letters and desperate circumstances. But Caleb kept stealing glances at Maren sitting beside him, the way the sunset turned her auburn hair to copper and gold. The way her hands rested calm in her lap, even though he could see the tension in her shoulders. It's not much, he finally said as the ranch came into view. A small house with a wraparound porch, a barn that needed new shingles, corrals holding a few dozen cattle. 2 bedrooms, kitchen, sitting room. There's a creek for washing, and the well water's clean, and your fences need mending, Maren interrupted, her eyes scanning the property with an expert's assessment. Barn roof's got loose boards, but the land's good. Rich grass, good water. How many head? Caleb blinked. Most women would have asked about the house, the kitchen, whether there were neighbors nearby. 83 cattle, he said. 12 horses? Used to be twice that before the hard winters and my mother's medical bills. We can rebuild, Maren said simply. I've worked cattle since I could walk. My father ran 300 head in Minnesota before the grasshopper plague of '74 destroyed everything. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, her boots hitting the dirt with solid thumps. Then she rolled up her sleeves and headed straight for the barn. Wait, Caleb called after her. Don't you want to see the house first? Rest from your journey? You've been traveling for 3 days. Maren turned back, and there was something fierce in her eyes now, something that made Caleb's breath catch. I didn't come here to rest, Mr. Thornwell. I came here to work. Show me what needs doing. For the next 6 hours, they worked side by side as the sun set and the stars came out like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Maren could lift hay bales that made Caleb's back scream in protest. She calmed a spooked horse with just her voice and the gentle pressure of her massive hands. She knew how to check cattle for disease, how to splice rope, how to read the weather in the way the wind shifted through the pines. And slowly, as Caleb watched her move through his ranch with easy confidence, his terror began mixing with something else. Admiration, respect, and something warmer that he didn't have a name for yet. They didn't talk much while they worked, just the occasional hand me that or watch the gate. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes when 2 people are moving toward the same goal. When they finally went inside, Maren cooked supper while Caleb washed at the basin, scrubbing 3 days of dirt and sweat from his face and arms. The kitchen filled with the smell of salt pork and beans and fresh bread she'd somehow made while he was tending the horses. They ate at the small wooden table his father had built, and the only sounds were forks scraping plates and the wind rattling the windows. Then Maren set down her fork and looked at him directly. You said you weren't experienced. With marriage, Caleb's back went rigid. His throat closed up. No, ma'am. My mother was sick for years. Consumption. There wasn't time for courting. So you've never... She left the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. The silence stretched out so long, Caleb thought he might suffocate. Then he forced himself to turn and face her, his cheeks burning so hot he probably looked like he had fever. No, he said quietly. Never. If you need to leave, I'd understand. I should have been clearer in my letter. I don't know anything about what happens between a husband and wife. Maren stood up, and Caleb's heart started hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. She crossed the small kitchen in 3 strides, and suddenly she was standing right in front of him, blocking out the lamplight, this massive woman who could probably break him in half if she wanted to. "Caleb," she said, and her voice was gentler than he'd heard it all day. "Look at me." He did with effort, tilting his head back to meet those green eyes that reminded him of deep forest pools. "I'm 32 years old," Maren said. "I've watched 5 younger sisters get married and have babies, while men called me handsome and sturdy instead of pretty. I'm too tall, too strong, too forward. Men either want to prove they can dominate me, or they're terrified I'll dominate them. You think I have vast experience?" Caleb stared. "You seem so confident." Maren laughed, but it was a sad sound, hollow and tired. "That's just survival, Caleb. When you're different, you learn to pretend you don't care what people think. But inside," she pressed one massive hand to her chest, "inside, I'm terrified you'll wake up tomorrow and realize you made a terrible mistake. That I'm too much woman for any man to actually want." The words hit Caleb like a revelation. All day he'd been thinking he wasn't enough, not tall enough, not strong enough, not experienced enough. But she'd been thinking the same thing, just the opposite direction. "You're not too much," he heard himself say. "I'm just afraid I'm not enough." Maren reached out and took his hand. Her palm completely swallowed his, calloused and warm and surprisingly gentle. "Then we'll learn together," she said. "No rush, partnership first. The rest, when we're ready. If we're ever ready." Relief flooded through Caleb, so intense his knees went weak. "You mean that?" "I mean that," Maren said. "We're in this together now, for real, not just legally." That night they slept in separate rooms, Maren in what had been his mother's room, Caleb in his own narrow bed that suddenly felt lonelier than it ever had before. But both of them lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of another person breathing in the next room, feeling something growing between them that neither had expected, something that felt almost like hope. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and discovery. Caleb woke before dawn every morning to find Maren already up, coffee brewing, boots laced, ready to tackle whatever the ranch demanded. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Caleb handling the horses and accounts, Maren managing the cattle and heavy repairs. But it was more than just work. It was the way she laughed when a calf kicked mud all over her dress. The way he caught her humming while she mended fences, old songs from her Minnesota childhood. The way they started sitting closer at supper, their conversations lasting longer, moving from practical ranch talk to stories about their lives. Maren told him about growing up the oldest of 6 daughters, how her father had taught her everything he'd teach a son because he needed the help. How the grasshopper plague of 1874 had destroyed 3 years of crops in 3 days. How she'd watched her father sit on the porch and cry like a child. How they'd lost everything, the farm, the cattle, even the seed for next year's planting. How her sisters had married local boys one by one, but Maren had grown too tall, too capable, too much. "I scared them," she said one evening, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "The boys my age. They didn't want a wife who could outwork them, outlift them. One boy told me I'd make a fine workhorse, but a terrible wife." Her voice was matter-of-fact. But Caleb saw the old hurt flickering in her eyes. He was an idiot, Caleb said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Maren looked at him, something soft crossing her face. "You're different than I expected." "How so?" "Most men would have sent me back on the first train. Or they'd spend every day trying to prove they're stronger, bigger, more in control." She set down her cup. "But you just let me be who I am." Caleb thought about that. "My mother used to say, people are like horses. You can break them or you can gentle them, and breaking might be faster, but gentling makes them loyal for life. I figure people deserve at least as much respect as horses." Maren smiled then, a real smile that made her whole face light up. And Caleb felt something warm bloom in his chest, dangerous, wonderful, terrifying. They started touching more, accidental at first. Hands brushing when they both reached for the same tool. Shoulders bumping while they worked side by side. But the touches started lasting longer, lingering, becoming intentional. Caleb found himself watching Maren when she didn't notice. The way her muscles moved under her dress, the strength and grace in every motion. And he'd catch her watching him too, something hungry and uncertain in her eyes that made his mouth go dry. One evening, after a long day of moving cattle to fresh pasture, Maren grabbed his hand and pulled him into the barn. "What?" Caleb started, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Shh! Listen." Music drifted from somewhere down the valley, someone having a barn dance, fiddles and guitars making rhythm against the night. "I've never danced," Caleb admitted, his face flushing. "Not once. My mother was too sick, and I never went to town socials." Maren grinned, and it was mischievous, playful, so different from her usual guarded expression. "Neither have I. Men don't ask giant women to dance." She pulled him into the center of the barn floor, hay dust swirling in the lamplight. "So we'll teach each other." What followed was clumsy, awkward, beautiful. They stepped on each other's feet. They couldn't figure out who should lead. They kept bumping into hay bales and laughing, real laughter that echoed off the rafters. And then, somewhere in the chaos, Caleb found himself pressed against Maren, her arms around him, his face buried against her shoulder, and they were swaying more than dancing, but it felt perfect. "Caleb," she whispered, and something in her voice made him look up. She was staring down at him, her eyes dark in the lamplight, and slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, she bent down and kissed him. This wasn't like their wedding kiss. This was soft and questioning and real. Caleb froze for just a second, every nerve in his body firing at once, and then some instinct older than thought took over, and he kissed her back, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maren's eyes were wide. "Was that okay?" she asked. "Yes," Caleb managed, his voice coming out rough and strange. Can we do it again?" She laughed and kissed him again, longer this time, deeper, and Caleb felt like he was falling and flying at the same time. They stayed in that barn for an hour, just kissing, learning each other, taking it slow. And when they finally went back to the house, Maren stopped at her bedroom door. "Still separate rooms," she said gently. "We're not ready yet, but soon maybe, when it feels right." Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. That night he couldn't sleep at all, his whole body humming with energy, with want, with something he was starting to realize might be love. But the next morning, everything fell apart. Caleb was in the barn checking on a horse with a swollen leg when he heard the sound of wagons approaching. He came out to find banker Grissom sitting in a fancy carriage flanked by two men with rifles, hired muscle from town. Maren was already outside, standing between the house and the bankmen, her body language protective, dangerous.
"Thornwell!"
Grissom called out, not bothering to dismount.
"Time's up."
$700 or you vacate by week's end. Caleb's stomach dropped. "You said 30 days. It's only been 21. Grissom smiled, and it was the smile of a snake that's just spotted a wounded rabbit. "Read the fine print. 30 days, or when the bank deems the property at risk. And I've deemed it." He gestured at Maren with barely concealed disgust. "A man and a woman of questionable capability can't make this ranch profitable. The bank's calling in the loan. You have 5 days to gather your things and leave." "That's not legal," Maren said, her voice deadly calm. "Actually, Miss Thornwell, it is," Grissom said, savoring every word. "The territorial courts will uphold it. And when they do, this land becomes bank property, which I'll then sell to the railroad for a tidy profit." He tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "Good day. Enjoy your last week playing ranch." The wagons rolled away, leaving dust and devastation in their wake. Caleb stood frozen, watching his entire world collapse for the second time in a month. $700. They might as well have asked for 7,000. He'd managed to scrape together $50 from selling some cattle, but the rest, impossible. "Caleb," Maren said, touching his arm. He jerked away, shame and rage boiling up inside him like poison. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out choked. "I brought you here promising a home and security, and I can't even give you that. You should leave. Take what money we have and go back to Minnesota. Find a man who isn't a complete failure." "Don't," Marin said sharply. "Don't you dare give up. Give up." Caleb laughed, and it was a bitter sound. "I've been fighting for 12 years to keep this place, and I'm about to lose everything my father built, everything my mother died believing I could save. I'm not giving up. I've already lost." Marin grabbed his shoulders, and her grip was strong enough to hurt. "Listen to me. I didn't travel 1,000 miles to watch you surrender. We're partners, remember? We figure this out together." "There's nothing to figure out," Caleb said, but even as he said it, he saw something calculating enter Marin's eyes. "What if there was a way to get that money?" she said slowly. "What if I told you I know how to make $700 in 5 days? Caleb stared at her. "That's impossible." "Not impossible," Marin said. "Just dangerous. And it means telling you something I've been hiding since the day I arrived." She took a deep breath, and for the first time since he'd met her, Caleb saw real fear in her eyes. "Before I came here, I wasn't just a farmer's daughter. I was the best bare-knuckle fighter in 3 counties. The warehouse outside Bozeman reeked of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and sweat. 200 men packed the space, shouting bets while Marin stood in the center ring, facing a brute named Mad Dog Sullivan, 6'4", 260 pounds of scarred muscle. The prize purse was $800. Winner takes all. Caleb watched from the corner, his heart in his throat. 3 days ago, Marin had told him everything. How she'd fought in backroom matches across Minnesota to help feed her family after the plague. How she'd never lost. How she'd stopped because it terrified her. The rage she felt in the ring. The way men looked at her like she was a freak, an animal. "I swore I'd never fight again," she'd said. "But for this ranch, for us, I'll do it." Now Sullivan charged, fists like hammers, and Marin moved like water, dodging, weaving. The crowd roared. But Sullivan was experienced, brutal. He caught her with a hook that split her lip, and blood sprayed across the dirt floor. Caleb wanted to stop it, to throw in the towel, but Marin had made him promise. "Trust me," she'd said. "For once in my life, let someone believe I'm strong enough." Sullivan pressed his advantage, driving Marin back against the ropes. The crowd was chanting his name. Grissom was in the front row, grinning like the devil himself. And then Marin moved. She ducked under Sullivan's haymaker, came up inside his guard, and drove her fist into his solar plexus with every ounce of pioneer strength she possessed. Sullivan's eyes went wide. He staggered. Marin followed with a right cross that Caleb heard connect from 20 feet away, the sound of knuckles on jawbone, brutal and final. Mad Dog Sullivan hit the dirt and didn't get up. The warehouse exploded. Men screaming, money changing hands, chaos. But Caleb only saw Marin, standing in the center of the ring with blood on her face and victory in her eyes, looking at him like he was the only person in the world. He climbed through the ropes and ran to her, and she caught him, lifting him clean off his feet, and he didn't care that 200 men were watching. He kissed her, hard and desperate, and full of everything he'd been too scared to say. "You did it," he whispered against her mouth. "We did it," she corrected. They paid Grissom the next morning, all $700 plus interest, and the look on his face was worth every bruise on Marin's knuckles. That night, in their small ranch house with the mortgage paid and the future suddenly bright, Marin stopped at her bedroom door. But this time, she didn't go in. "I'm ready if you are," she said quietly. Caleb's heart hammered. "I'm terrified." "So am I," Marin admitted. "But we'll figure it out together. Like everything else." She held out her hand and Caleb took it. And when she led him into their bedroom, not his room or her room, but theirs, and closed the door behind them, he finally understood what "you will" had always meant. Not a command, a promise. That she'd be patient, that she'd teach him, that together they'd learn what love really meant. Outside, Montana stars burned cold and brilliant. Inside, 2 people who'd been told their whole lives they were wrong finally discovered they were exactly right. For each other.